This is House Planning Help episode 283. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is architectural technologist Tim Martel, and we're going to be looking at modelling embodied carbon, how you do that for your home. Most relevant, I guess, actually, if you're building to Passive House standard, because you'll be using PHPP already, and this that we're hearing about, this tool, is a plug-in to that. Before we start, though, today, what can go wrong with your build? We did an episode on this a few weeks ago, and I certainly didn't put this in. You think of all the things that can happen to you personally, like running out of money or perhaps a relationship breakdown that can really put the spanner in the works. You don't necessarily think external factors, a war kicking off, for example, and we've had not a war, but it feels a bit like it in some ways because the coronavirus is doing the rounds as we record this podcast. I've kept quiet about it over the last couple of weeks, just not quite sure what's happening, but now it's pretty much full lockdown. And so that means that people in the middle of their projects, if we think how lucky we were for our project just going through, and I know I've seen hub members, have also seen calls out on Twitter, the building inspector, they're just not available at the moment. None of them are there to do their work. So how do we sign off the work? So all sorts of things happening. It's just not something that you can anticipate. So my thoughts are very much with you if you're in the middle, no matter what stage you're at. You expect all the little challenges that come up, not something like this. Who said building a house would be easy? There's always something. It's always something. Let's get to our interview then. And actually, Tim sent me a little bit of an introduction. So I'm just going to read that because it makes my job very easy here. Although embodied CO2 isn't at the moment a large part of the total footprint of a passive house, it is more than for a typical building and is becoming more important as the grid decarbonises. So what I'm reading here, I guess, probably more relevant if you're in the UK. Some of the details will vary if you're in other parts of the world. Heating and plug loads are heading towards being decarbonised. For electricity, that process is already well underway. Domestic heating is mostly using natural gas, and that also has a target to be decarbonised as well. After 2025, gas boilers won't be available. The largest part of what remains after these head towards zero is the embodied CO2 of the construction. So this is important. We know it is. We've discussed it before. We'll be back here again. I know that. But today, specifically on the modelling side, we haven't talked about how you might go about doing that and what you'd find out. So let's do that. Let's chat to Tim. And I started by asking him to tell me a little bit about his background.
Well, I'm an architectural technologist. I became qualified as an architectural technologist about 8 years ago. Before that, I was a programmer and various specialists in technical role. The programming is important because now I'm using quite a lot of that for architectural work. So after the architectural technology, in fact, during the architectural technology degree, I became very interested in Passive House, and soon afterwards, I became qualified as a Passive House designer, then worked for Warm in Plymouth, and then started working for the AECB, the Carbon Light Retrofit course, which has now been around for a few years. And at that time, we were developing the course material, and I spent a few years developing a spreadsheet in order to calculate the financial side of it, and also the moisture. We were looking at the moisture side from a series of 10 or 15 different houses which had been retrofitted. So quite a lot going on. And since then, I've been involved in new build and retrofit as a Passive House designer. Then we thought, well, maybe we could get some of the things that we've been using, maybe we could make it available to people as a product. So that's how PHribbon came about as well.
We're going to talk a lot about this, but are there any tools that exist in this area, or is this really something that's developing at great speed because we all realise how important this is?
Well, there are specialists who do embodied CO2. I'm not the only one. What's new is that this is the only one that's actually specifically written to work with PHPP. And that's useful because it means that you can get an answer really quickly.
Because you've already inputted a lot of detail.
Yeah, because say 80% of the information you need is already in the PHPP, and there's a little bit that you also need extra. There's some things that aren't covered in the PHPP. So, for example, internal walls, internal floors. That's the intermediate floors. The ground floor is a thermal element, but the first floor, if it's a two-story building, isn't a thermal element, so it wouldn't normally be in the PHPP. So that has to be added as well. That's an easy thing to do. And also things like roof coverings. So slate or tile roof covering wouldn't normally be mentioned in the PHPP.
Just zooming out for a second to look at this embodied CO2, what are the elements then that we need to consider that is really forming part of your program?
Well, the whole calculation is built around a RICS document. RICS is the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, and they wrote a document a while ago, 2017, called Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment. And that's a professional statement. So it's not just a recommendation. It's what RICS members have to adhere to when they're doing this kind of calculation. And that really sets down in a lot of detail what is expected of the calculation. Now, I can't do a full RICS compliant calculation because that would only be possible after the building is built, and you can take from your quantities, from your delivery notes, the exact quantities that were used. What I'm aiming to do is use the quantities that are in PHPP, which are close, but they could be refined a little bit later, to give you a very good idea of what the embodied CO2 of the building is going to be.
So you've covered quite a bit there. Let's have a look at RICS first then. So what is it that they are supplying? Have they gone through every single different material and tried to trace it back? Because presumably, even if you've got the same material, your supplier will change the embodied CO2, or not that much, actually?
They haven't got involved in actually supplying the figures. It's really European standards that they're working to. So the EPDs, as they're called, environmental product declarations, those should be working to EN standards. And also they go through the whole lifetime calculation and go into a lot of detail about what should be done at each stage and what assumptions should be used at each stage. Because one of the problems is we've had calculations coming up for a few years now from various organizations, and even the same building, when different organizations do it, you get different answers from different people. And they wanted to standardize things in a way that you would get a reliable result. And obviously this is a bit of a problem if you can't get a reliable result. So they've said, in the absence of definite information, they've put forward defaults or expectations of what you should be doing. And in other places, they've actually said, well, let's assume this.
Right. So this is still an area that's developing, but let me see if I understand this. So it's the product declarations, which I'm assuming is some independent source.
Environmental product, EPDs, yes.
Which starts us off. Yeah. That's where all of this grows from. Right.
Yes.
So your side of things is actually dealing with the information that you've got there, that no doubt will be constantly developing and hopefully getting more accurate over time.
Absolutely. And these a lot of companies are producing these declarations. A lot have been produced already. And it's quite nice to see. There's a whole range of them. There's about 200 entries that I've got in PHribbon from those. And it covers wood fibre, all these materials, wood, timber, metals. Some products don't tend to have declarations for them, things like brick.
Is that on purpose?
Well, it's generally, I don't know, they do. Some do have some information, but it tends to be the more insulation materials. Brick is a bit variable. Brick manufacturers, I suppose they don't see it as a particularly important thing. Brick isn't a terribly environmental product in that it uses quite a lot of energy to produce.
Is this going to be one of the challenges then of the system, that it's fine if you've got an environmental product, but if you haven't, you're going to be very reluctant to put forward any information?
Well, exactly. Yes, you don't want to make your company look bad, do you? So,
Yeah. Okay, so you've got that information, whether it's complete or not. Hopefully, over time, it will get more complete and more accurate. Then, how is that being used? How does it work within your plugin to PHPP?
Right. Well, you start off in the PHPP. It can be any PHPP. Doesn't have to be a special one. And you start this ribbon, which has to be installed.
What is a ribbon?
Oh, ribbon. What is a ribbon? Right. Well, for a while, Microsoft have made it possible for you to customize the ribbon bar. That's the kind of toolbar that you see at the top of the screen for Excel and for other programs. And you could have your own custom one. And that's handy because if you're working in a company and you only use a few tools, then it might be that your company customizes the ribbon in order to give you just the tools you need and work with all the time at the top there to make it more productive for you. And they can even add extra utilities in there, write custom things. And I thought, well, that's really handy. Why don't we have one for Passive House? It's about time. So I looked into how feasible it would be, and I wrote it.
So this is work that seems to be taking more and more of your time now, doesn't it?
A bit, yes, a bit.
or does it just keep on going?
It's leveling off because
right.
It started about 2 years ago, and I wrote quite a simple ribbon and relatively simple embodied CO2 as well, which is only entirely based on the ICE database developed by Craig Jones of Bath University. And about a year ago, I started to think about updating that. And recently, when I presented at a masterclass, the PHribbon, and there was a lot of interest in the RIBA 2030 standard. And at that time, the ribbon didn't do full life CO2. And that's a bit of a problem because it means it couldn't be used. So I thought it might be time to develop that a bit further. And now it's ready. So that's where we are now.
Now, I'm not sure I went through the complete process. I think I probably interrupted you of how we are making this work, though, as a user. So we're doing our PHPP model anyway. We're at that stage.
Yeah.
Or do we need to do stuff as we develop the model?
Well, I suppose it may not be the sort of thing that everyone does. I mean, if you want a embodied CO2 calculation and it's only a one-off, you may not buy the software. You might just have the calculation done. But if you're doing several and you want to keep track of things, then you might buy the software, and there's a series of dialogues that you go through. It matches up materials for you. So you've got in PHPP, it's called a U-values tab, and that details all the materials that are used in all the constructions in the building and matches them up pretty much automatically. But you're able to oversee that matching process. And if you can find a better match, it'll give you a small selection of close matches. If you can see a better match or a more appropriate one, then you can select that one. And it remembers the last association you made. So it's quite clever in that respect. So within a little while, you can arrive at an answer for all those materials. You then have to just add the extras, the floors, intermediate floors, internal walls that I was mentioning before, and roof finish, and one or two other things if you want, windows and PV, and then it's done. So it's relatively quick.
And what are you coming out with it as an answer? Is it, this many kilograms of CO2?
The RICS requires kilograms of CO2 per meter squared of NIA, net internal area. So it can provide that as long as you can provide what the net internal area is. Otherwise, it has a graph which you can change the units. Actually, you might want to see the results in several different ways. So it will provide it in terms of total CO2 in kilograms for the whole building, kilograms of CO2 per meter squared of TFA, that's the usable space in Passive House language, or it'll also do CO2 per person, because actually that's quite an interesting one, because if you've got a really large house for only 2 people, that's a little bit inefficient in terms of CO2 per person. That highlights that one. I don't know anyone who's using that, but I thought that would be an interesting one to add.
How are you finding whether this is accurate? Is there any way of telling?
The way of telling is to assess it against the criteria of the RIC standard. I would like to have it checked against some other professionals, and that will be done in the near future. But at the moment, it's just because it's been following very closely the RIC standard. But in any case, as I say, this isn't an official calculation.
No, but it would just be interesting for accuracy with all these things. Is there any way to make it more accurate, or is it always going to be slightly up in the air?
Well, the accuracy is an interesting one because there's a few things in there where the accuracy is a little bit uncertain. So what I've been doing with the PHribbon, I've been tracing where there could be some inaccuracy, and I've been marking that in the PHribbon tool. So you get, for example, you get a color, red, green, or orange. So red is the least accurate or least confident. And sometimes that can be a RICS assumption. It's not necessarily something that we don't know. It could be something that we've just assumed, which is just a little bit inaccurate. So, for example, the transport distance from various manufacturers to the site, there's a standard RICS assumption for that, which is 300 kilometers for if it's a national one, a national product. And that's fair enough. That's a RICS assumption, and that's what we're going to use. But in actual fact, it's probably a bit different to that, isn't it, really? It could be more, could be less. And so that's red. And if you take something else like an EPD answer, well, that's been worked out quite carefully. So we'll take that as good accuracy. That's generally green. And then there are other figures which are, the ICE database, the Bath University database. I've made those orange, not because they're less accurate as such, because a lot of work's been put into them, but because they may be less accurate for this house, because they're an average of several EPDs. In other words, if you can be more specific about the material and use the actual EPD for that material, then we've got a more confident answer. If you've got a figure from the ICE database, which is at the average of several EPDs, they generally are, then it can average out something that would be, it could be high, it could be low. In the event, if you use the ICE data, then you've got an average, you don't see that. It could be worse than it's actually presented. And that's why that's an orange figure, that's an average.
Just looking at some completed buildings then, what sort of figures, can you give us any examples of what you're getting?
Well, it's quite early days, but I've got answers I've done about 5 or 10 examples which I've worked out. Some have been published in the Passive House Plus magazine, but that was before I was including the full life model. But actually, I've gone back to those and calculated it again using the whole life calculation. So I've got those. And so for a typical semi-detached house, it would be about 14 tons for the whole life, and about 10 of those are just for the materials itself.
And is there any way to just sort of flip it over to see, well, what if instead of brick we'd use something else?
Absolutely. And this is one of the great things about it, that there's a graph in which you're comparing one thing with another, and you get your result, and that will be one bar on the graph. And then next to it, you can add another option. You could say, well, this is the building built out of timber. And then the other option might be, this is the building built out of brick. So you could either compare elements of that, or you can change the whole thing.
And we had Chris Magwood from the Endeavour Centre on a little while ago talking about embodied carbon. He's someone who's worked around plant-based materials for a long time, but he was suggesting that it might be possible to create a house that actually stores carbon within it, so it's a carbon sink.
Oh, well, yes. And that's what a lot of people are doing at the moment, if you look at the more typical timber constructions where we're using I-beam and cellulose, then both of them have quite a large storage component. And that means that when you look at the results, you see a large bar representing all that storage, which offsets all the emissions in the RICS calculation.
Well, that's got to be quite exciting, hasn't it, really? The
future
just being more intentional about all of this, as with any modelling.
Yeah, there is a catch with that, though. One of the assumptions is that in order to include the storage, you have to do a full life calculation, and it has to be also PSC or FSC timber, grade timber. So as long as you've got that, you can include the storage figure. But even when that's included, one of the assumptions in RICS is that the wood is incinerated at the end of its life, and 75% of it is incinerated and 25% of it goes to landfill. And that's a standardized assumption. They do suggest that you always have that as your default assumption, but you can create other scenarios. And that's where I've been talking to the AECB about this. It's an AECB product, so we're talking internally about this. And we're quite excited about the possibility of developing other scenarios which start to appear automatically. Unfortunately, the information for those isn't currently available. People don't really produce much information about recycling, reuse, that you'd need to be able to produce those in the EPD as alternatives. So you've got a timber building, and you look at the resultant graph, and you see this big stage C, which is the end of life. You see this big contribution from that at the end of life. But if you could substitute that incineration for a different process where it was recycled, if you could say, well, this building has been built so that it can be taken apart, can be recycled, this material is ideal for being recycled, it can be made into OSB or perhaps MDF or, anything. If that can be done and we can prove the figures for it with an EPD for that process, then you could legitimately add that as another option. And I think some manufacturers are taking a great interest in this already.
Am I right in thinking that the future of all this, hopefully all these things coming together, life cycle, but it's only going to get more accurate?
I think so, yes. At the moment, I'm really quite surprised and very heartened by the fact that there are quite a lot of EPDs out there already, and there is quite a lot of information, and other countries seem to be doing a tremendous amount. Here in the UK, we're doing a fair amount too. Ireland's got a lot of EPDs. Germany's got a lot of EPDs. The information is only going to get better, and we were in quite a good position already. It's just that now that things are hotting up a little bit, we can start to see where the missing information is, and perhaps we can talk to those and encourage them to get that done. A lot of companies have EPDs, but they miss out some critical information about the whole life of the product. So they'll produce an EPD for the actual manufacturing process, and you have to produce that if you're going to produce an EPD. But what's also really useful is not necessarily to cover every stage, because we have our own defaults set by RICS for that anyway, but to look at particularly the end of life stage C4 and stage D. That would be really useful. The stage D is where you can include the reuse, recycling, all those benefits which are considered outside the actual boundary of the actual calculation, but can be presented separately. And also C4, which is the end of life, the incineration, etc.
With any modelling, it's obviously great for accuracy. Let's assume the whole system gets more accurate. But what about if you can't do it every time? Do you think you tune into the danger areas and you can do a little bit of a mental calculation, or is that dangerous territory?
Well, I suppose there should be guidelines, and I think this might be something the AECB does, produce guidelines for what might be a good strategy. Some people say, well, I don't need a calculation done, I'll just go with timber and that'll be fine. And that's not really quite really accurate, because, okay, you're using timber, but what if you've got concrete foundations? Or how much does that contribute? Is it important? Is that too much concrete, or is that okay? There are other materials which might seem unimportant to you, which actually end up being quite a large part of the calculation. It's not quite as straightforward as it might sound.
It's complex, isn't it? Well, finally, is there anything else that we should know about this, either about it now as a product or where you're hoping to go to in the future?
I think I've covered where we're hoping to go. I think we're hoping to refine these graphs. So at the moment, we've got the option that was set by RICS. We're hoping to refine that so that you actually have other options available as well, where you can look at the recycled or reuse options, and that requires more further information. So this is going to be quite an exciting time, actually, because we're going to be gathering that information, and as that becomes available, it'll be put in to the software, and then people will be able to look at slightly better scenarios of what happens there, and may work out better for their product. It'll look better if you can choose a more sustainable option.
Well, Tim, thank you very much for your time today, and really appreciate it. Nice one.
Thank you very much.
Get more in the show notes today at houseplanninghelp.com/283, where we've got our regular summary. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that within the show notes as well. More links to PHribbon, to Tim, if you want to have a chat with him, houseplanninghelp.com/283. So we started this episode by mentioning the coronavirus and how it's got a lot of us housebound at the moment. For some of us, that must mean an overload of time, that we can do all sorts of things. We've probably already cleaned the house, sorted out all those cupboards that we've always wanted to. We still got time on our hands. And that's why I wanted to mention, if you are one of those people, because if you've got kids, it's a completely different situation and you're probably in chaos at the moment and struggling to get any time to yourself. But yeah, if you're one of those ones who's got a bit of time and you're looking to use that in a profitable way for your house build, well, check out the Hub. This is our online resource. It's perfect for this sort of situation because you need time to be able to invest into it and to get the most out of it because of all the videos that we've made that are in there, all the live trainings, those conference calls with guest experts where we try to give you something, a presentation to lead you through things. Here we have a chat on the podcast, but this is much more about just trying to take you from A to B, whereas quite often when I chat to people, we go A to Z and then back to T and all over. We've got our course library as well. We've got our members only forum, and there's a lot to learn from them because they're actively doing this, going through the process, and you can interact with them, help them, they can help you. And we've got my office hour calls that just allows you, if there's anything that you want to check in with me personally, then you can do that as well. If you want to find out more about the Hub, you can do that at houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, I'm heading back to Gravenhill, and we're just round the corner from where they filmed Grand Design's The Street. So that should be interesting. What am I doing? Well, come back here next time, and I'll tell you all about that. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.